All right. The Visiting Artist Program, funded by PAFA's graduate program, brings an outstanding roster of local, national, and international artists to PAFA each semester for lectures, critiques, and workshops. The program exposes students and the public to a range of artistic approaches and fosters discussions about contemporary art and ideas. This evening, we are pleased to have Lauren Frances Adams joining us. Lauren Frances Adams is a painter who lives and works in Baltimore. She earned her BFA from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and her MFA at Carnegie Mellon University. She grew up in Snow Hill, North Carolina on a pig farm. Her work engages political and social histories through iconic images and domestic ornament. Her work has been exhibited across the United States at museums, university galleries, and artist-run spaces, with an upcoming 2021 project at the Baltimore Museum of Art. She attended the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, along with many others. She is the recipient of the Joan Mitchell Foundation MFA Award and a 2016 Pollock Krasner Foundation Award. Americans for the Arts recognized projects she co-produced in 2011 and 17 as outstanding public art. Her work has been published in Frieze Magazine, Be More Art, The Baltimore Sun, Art Slant, and Hyperallergenic. Lauren was a founding member of the Ortega y Gasset Projects, a project space in New York. Lauren teaches full-time at the painting department of Maryland Institute of College of Art, So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Lauren. And Lauren, you may now begin sharing your screen.
Thank you, Lily. Thanks so much for that great introduction. I have given like dozens of talks on my work and I always still get nervous. So, you know, can feel my throat like scratchier than it needs to be. So I'm just gonna do my best here. Thanks y'all for having me. Thank you so much for inviting me to do this talk. And also thanks to all the incredible students who I met with throughout the day with really dynamic and inspiring work. I really appreciated our conversations and I'm glad I can be here to share some of what I do. Okay. So you'll just holler at me if something doesn't show up right. And normally when I'm talking, especially in a smaller group like this, I'll just say, hey, raise your hand if you have a question. Like maybe sometimes I get caught up talking about materials and forget to talk about the ideas, or I get caught up talking about ideas and forget to talk about materials. So Lily assured me that they're keeping an eye on the chat. So if something urgent comes through, Lily, just feel free to like interrupt me and I'll go with it, okay? Yeah, and thanks to y'all for being here because of all the Zoom stuff. I haven't been on Zoom this long and since the end of last semester, and it's been a nice break, but it's like, wow, thank you for coming and taking part in this with me, given that we actually have things we can go out in the world and do, which didn't seem like a possibility a few months ago. So I just want to share a little bit about me before I get started, because I think my context and identity and positionality is really important. There's my website. Feel free to go check out the work. There's often more pictures there, some text that I've written about projects, as well as kind of filling in the gaps since I can't show you everything. And yes, I'm in Baltimore, Maryland right now. I'm from North Carolina, Eastern North Carolina. I've lived in Pittsburgh, so I've lived in Pennsylvania for 4 years when I was in grad school, and then I lived in St. Louis before too. And so I've been in Baltimore about 9 years now. I'm in the Charles Village kind of Greenmount neighborhood near Micah, if you know Midtown Baltimore at all. So I just like to start a little bit. This is actually work from undergrad. It's a charcoal drawing, about 18 by 24, self-portrait from when I was in college, and it explains kind of the context of my family history in terms of the long line of farmers that I'm a descendant of, where I spent 18 years of my life before going to college in North Carolina, a couple hours away from where I grew up, the ways in which I came to know materials and ideas earlier in my youth, as well as my deeply trained representational painting and drawing practice that kind of forms the foundation of who I am as an artist. I also want to share, this is kind of like so you can kind of imagine Eastern North Carolina, the place where I grew up, the house on the left, the first 10 or 12 years of my life, the house on the right where my mom lives today, just about a mile apart from one another. And in the background on the left, you can see the pig farm. Yes, well water, drinking well water from that place for many, many years. And still forms a large part of like what I identify with in terms of landscape and thinking through the histories, particularly of Eastern North Carolina and its impact on my work. So I'm going to play this short video. It's about 2 minutes long. And this was a video that my mom helped me do when I was 10 years old of my great grandma. And she's going to share a story, and then I'm going to recap it for you because you may not be able to understand everything of what she's saying given the quality of the video. Let me know if the audio does not play.
Is it ready? Yeah. Back in those days, Lauren, they didn't have cough syrup like we have now. The mothers made their cough syrup. They took molasses and vinegar and different things and fixed it for the cough syrup ointment. And even when your mama was born, I was standing at the stove with her in my arm, and I had a oil stove, and I opened the door down. I had potatoes a baking to feel to see if they were soft. One of them popped, and it burnt her eye bad. And Granddaddy went and carried her to a Mala man, and he talked the fire out. It never did hurt. She's never had a scar from it. You might not believe in things like that, but her eyes, she screamed. I thought we'd never get her hushed. It hurt, you know it did. And but back in my days, when I turned that washpot over on my foot, that Papa got some off from a man. He didn't have to carry it to the doctor. It doctored it like that.
So I hope y'all could hear that okay. It was kind of quiet on my end, but what she's talking about is my grandma, her daughter, my grandma Geraldine, my mom's mom, was a little baby and got burned from hot potato from the stove, and she and her husband, my great grandfather, took my grandmother to a mullah man to talk the fire out, which is a kind of folk practice of soothing someone who's been burned through folk ways and knowledge that is very special and often passed down through very special circumstances. And I'm sharing that because these are the kind of ways in which I'm attempting to and beginning to understand and learn and know ancestral knowledge in ways that feel very important to me as an artist. And also thinking about my relationship with my family, especially the women in my family. And I'll point to a couple of things I have in the room with me. My great grandma, Lma Wheeler's biscuit tray that she would knead biscuit dough on over my shoulder. And just behind me here, one of the quilts that I have inherited that she made out of feed sack cloth, which is a kind of quilt making practice in 30s, 40s, 50s. And I have a few of her quilts that are dear to me, some of the few things I've tangibly, physically inherited from my family that have influenced the kind of purpose and aesthetic that I have as an artist. The next thing I'll share, it's always difficult to advance. There we go. The next thing I'll share is just some background about my family. This is a document from the early 1800s showing the land that was being gifted, passed along between great-great-greats of mine to another great-great-great of mine in Eastern North Carolina. This is not the same land that I grew up on. It's my father's family's property that is no longer in the family, but was only recently sold in my lifetime. And these are documents that not only list the sale of that land, list the sale of furniture, or list the bestowing of that land, and also list the passing on of furniture, but also this is the passing on of people. My ancestors were enslavers, as far as I understand from the amateur genealogy that I have done over the past few years after being made aware of these documents. It's part of my reckoning with and understanding my own family's place in the settler colonial history of Eastern North Carolina, and also my place and role as an artist in the present, and as a white woman in the present, and understanding, reckoning with, and making not just amends, but also making sense of the kind of violent white supremacist history of this country. So I tell you all of that because it's an important way to kind of situate where I come from in terms of my identity. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about like my artistic philosophies, not just thinking through materials and, you know, things like quilts, but also pattern and decoration. Here's a quote from Mary Douglas, the British anthropologist, where she's talking about concepts of inclusion and exclusion, and a very particular kind of obsession with purity and how that is often shown and displayed culturally. You know, of course, changing across cultures, but often specifically related to domestic space. And so domestic space is something that I've worked with a lot in my work and has formed the basis of a lot of my political and social commentary. This is work that I was making right out of undergrad when as you all have probably heard by now, like the pulling out of the troops in Afghanistan by the Biden administration over the past few months and for the next month or two is part of a 20 years long war that this country has engaged, if not, of course, before that, in other parts of the world related to post 9/11 military industrial complex. And so one of the goals that I had when I was a younger artist was finding ways to bring those conversations that were happening about national and global politics, and also making sense of the military culture and the war machine, and especially for my vision as a pacifist, how to bring that context and that national and international conversation into my work. And there was a kind of revival of French toile, which is this kind of pattern that you see. And so I was taking images from newspapers in Iraq and Afghanistan about like the military movements that were happening there, as well as protests that were happening, which I was participating in alongside making this kind of work, and hand painting this these kinds of mashup patterns onto reclaimed vintage furniture. And the kind of natural conclusion of that was to really start thinking through, well, what does it mean to make a painting onto furniture? What is the relationship between the decorative arts and the fine arts, craft, you know, those sort of divisions and hierarchies that we're all very familiar with, having discussions about in the art world, were the same things that have been on my mind. This is a Russian avant-garde writer and critic, Osip Brik, who wrote an essay that was very influential to me, thinking through about the collapsing of those distinctions, that the decorative is an expression of the social and political, and that art can go into life. And so the natural outcome of that was to make an entire kind of like tableau of a middle-class American dining room, especially a Southern one, which is often a place for conspicuous display, especially for white Southerners, of a kind of middle class or an aspiring middle class identity. And in this case, I tried to treat every surface as a kind of site for intervention related to things like the removal of cornfields into condominium blocks, the relationship of like changing immigration environment and status in particularly Eastern North Carolina, as the many folks from Mexico and Central America were coming to the South, and especially to Eastern North Carolina, and you know, influencing the ways in which like public notions of citizenship were being shaped when I was a kid in the 90s and 2000s. Also inclusion of like, again, war related imagery. So planes in the sky, you know, the Humvee as an example of like a military vehicle that was then adopted for civilian use, and trying to kind of bring all of that like mixture of those different environments into the domestic space. So I'm kind of jumping ahead now, and I just want to share a project that I spent about, I don't know, 5 to 7 years in the period from like late 2000s through the 2010s working on. And it is a kind of outcropping project related to the history of British settlement and colonization of what has been called the New World. So North America, the Western Hemisphere, the idea of, particularly during the Elizabethan age, which you might recognize this collar painted as a giant mural on this wall. And also trying to think through like what that means for those of us American citizens in the present that do speak English, that, you know, thinking about the relationship between settler colonial environment and the context for settlement from the 16th and 17th centuries to the kinds of financial systems that we have today, such as capitalism, right? So this was really a project that was trying to make sense of that. And these are the kind of images that I was researching at the time. I often get asked a lot about my research as an artist, and I do want to share some of that. I try not to chalk too much of that into the lecture because we only have so much time, but I think it's really important to acknowledge the kind of visual culture that was happening in England at the time of much of the privateering and piracy that was happening by the British, not just in North America, but also around the globe. And here you see a painting on the left of Queen Elizabeth, and then two paintings on the right from a British artist that we don't know very much about. His name was John White, and he did document in Eastern North Carolina and probably Virginia and Maryland, so parts of the Chesapeake Bay, which are in many ways connect where I live now with where I grew up, just thinking geographically about the waterways that connect these places. John White's British depictions of flora, fauna, and the peoples that he tried to credibly transcribe. However, as you can see, these are not necessarily, you know, accurate, straightforward depictions of an eagle or a human being. They're actually quite mannered and very much in the taste and tradition of study that would have been consumed by and really with an eye towards consumption and exploitation of resources, and that includes people of this new world. So I'm giving you that context because in understanding the kind of visual culture that I was thinking through with these kinds of projects, it was really also reckoning with the many ways in which British idea and understanding of what settlement meant, and not just from like an economic or social point of view or religious point of view, but also from a visual culture kind of place, how images become, you know, exercise, propagandized, right? This is a kind of propaganda, and how important it is to recognize that when it's appropriated into my work. And so here would be an example of a kind of painting that I was making, trying to parse through some of that imagery, collapsing like the decorative patterns from Queen Elizabeth's clothing, which were part of the sumptuary laws of the time, who could wear what, depending on your class or royalty status, with the kind of supposedly innocent pictures of flora and fauna that were brought back as a kind of trading cards from the, like I said, New World, quote unquote, to England. And so this mural, so I had a lot of mural training experience when I was in college, and that was one of the ways that informed me with wanting to work really large scale. And so this piece took about a week. It's latex paint, it's just black and white paint. And you can see it's a lacy collar, but as you get closer and closer to it, you realize that the figures embedded in it are the same figures found in the John White watercolors that he painted on his voyage from England to the coast of North Carolina, which would be the Outer Banks today. So, you know, the idea of his interpretations of native and natural life were about this colonial consumption, and the paintings of Queen Elizabeth were aggrandizing her empire and power. And the point I was trying to kind of discover or like, you know, uncover in the work was the relationship between that eventual kind of colonial, that violent colonial settler expansion that really kind of began during that critical period in the late 1500s in Eastern North Carolina. And those watercolors, by the way, are in England at the British Library, or the British Museum, if ever you want to see them. And I happened to see them when I was traveling back in North Carolina, back home. They were at the North Carolina History Museum, from a kind of rare chance to see them on the side of the Atlantic. And that kind of kicked off a bunch of work that I made for a few years that was also just about exploring in the language of painting, how to understand and grapple with this legacy, not just the legacy of the visual imagery of British Empire, but also the kind of legacy of the way we understand anthropology and nature, and how those those studies have been deployed for, you know, sexist, racist, classist means over time. So these are more examples of the John White watercolors, and you'll see these examples showing up in some of my paintings as kind of quoted in the work. And, you know, I would say this is also where I kind of began to form my own kind of understanding of how to work, often with gouache and acrylic, and using positive and negative space, trying to sort of mash up, you know, elements or fragments of, you know, Elizabethan clothing with maybe like natural objects from John White's watercolors. And I have a whole bunch of other work from the series. You can see it on my website if you want. And Lily, how are we doing? Any questions or anything coming up?
Yeah, we have one question. I mean, I don't want to mess with your train of thought, though. I mean, if you want to take it, you can, but we can also just keep going until 45, and that's when I can give you them all. But it's totally up to you.
Okay, well, I'll just keep going, and we'll make sure to leave time. Okay.
All right. Yeah.
Okay, great.
I'll give you a little something.
Okay, great.
Time.
Okay, great. Okay, so another piece I wanted to share is this artwork from American University in Washington, D.C. So the fabulous artists and professors at American, Zoe Charlton and Tim Dowd, invited me to do a long-term site-specific project in their rotunda, which is in their art building, art, music, you know, they're kind of all art building there on campus. And so it was the opportunity to really think through how to create something that would be on long-term display, but actually I didn't have the opportunity to paint long-term on site the way I had with the previous mural I was sharing. And so I kind of, this is where I started to develop the way of working that I often use now, of like hand painting things in my studio. And then often those things are at like a fraction of the scale, let's say a quarter or half size, and then scanning or photographing those paintings. And then, you know, in a software like Photoshop, digitally manipulating them into large scale files that I can paint, that I can then print out, usually on what's called adhesive backed wallpaper. So it's like, you know, a vinyl it's not even paper, it's like a vinyl material that it's like giant sticker paper. And I will work with a printer to create like many feet of this. You know, it can often take like a whole day to print something this scale. And the benefit of it is that often when it's installed, like cut, you know, around the painted imagery, it looks as if it's hand painted. So it has the appearance of a mural, but it actually is quick, super easy to go up, quick, super easy to come down, and is very durable and not so expensive either. And so this is the kind of technique that I've used more and more when there's limitations with actually painting on site, and knowing often that if I spend weeks painting on site, as the murals that were done that I was inspired by in this piece, that it would be crushing to then see them painted over just a year later. So about this project, it's the idea of this piece was related to these frescoes that are in the US Capitol building, which is only 6 miles from this building where my work is. So I updated those mid 19th century frescoes. So these are just kind of general photos to show you the feel of it. And there's like a little title information there with like, you know, text about the project so that you could read more about it. And then I'm going to show you I might have to come back to this, but it says, after Constantino Brumidi at the United States Capitol building, frescoes which he painted over 150 years ago, 6 miles southeast from this location. These pictures were made by L. Adams in 2014 with scenery from around our great country, America, views of devastation that could only be caused by humans. Clockwise, beginning on your right, this sad list includes, but is not limited to, fracking in our grand state of Pennsylvania, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, mountaintop removal mining in underrepresented West Virginia, the unfortunate Deepwater Horizon oil spill in our Gulf of Mexico, and glacial retreat in Alaska due to climate change. And so that's meant to be the kind of legend or key to help you piece through the images that you're seeing around the whole rotunda. And I'm using the visual language too of the murals by Constantino Brumidi, who was an Italian-born artist. This is what they look like. If you go, you can go tour the Capitol building and see this elaborate decorative schema that he based on Raphael's Loggia, which is in the Vatican in Italy. And so it's meant to be aspiring to, in this, like, you know, kind of burgeoning American idea of itself, you know, like the great classical art of Europe, which was certainly one of the ideals of the lawmakers who commissioned Brumidi to make these images. And so apparently he copied these images from these books, these lithographs in the Pacific Railroad Report and the Mexican Boundary Report, which were published right before he started painting all of these things. And it's possible that he was incorporating these landscapes to not only celebrate this scenic visions of America, but also to promote a kind of comprehensive identity of American geography and the inevitable settlement of what became the Western United States. And so also because he was trying to promote specificity of place, the birds that are pictured often in these paintings by him point to the importance of uniquely American subject matter in his work. And you can see that he left open spaces. So this, obviously, they didn't land on the moon in the 1850s. So what he did was he left open spaces to then later artists could paint important events in American history. And so I took that idea as like my impetus for my project, which was to say, like, what happens if instead of visualizing these great moments in American history, we actually acknowledge and try to wrap our arms around the shame of ecological destruction in this country. And so that was the premise upon which I took my project. And so you can see here things like invasive species like the cabbage white butterfly, or in this case, there would be like these cartouches of scenes. So this would be the oil spill in the Gulf. And then I would often incorporate birds that were impacted by these environmental disasters, which would sometimes either be an event or an unfolding process, such as in the case of climate change. And you can even see on the end caps, the Carolina parakeet and the passenger pigeon, which are examples of birds that have gone extinct due to human encroachment on their habitat or human activity. This is mountaintop removal mining, which would be, you know, like the runoff is the orange, electric orange in the creeks. I specified climate change as a glacial retreat in Alaska. So it's not necessarily so much that you can see that the glacier is moving, but this is an example of a glacier in Alaska that had a rapid recession because of how warm it was getting there and still is. Tufted puffins. It's really hard to make garbage look good in an image. This is supposed to be the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which actually, by the way, is not always, you know, the problems in the waterways aren't always actual garbage. It can actually be microplastics, which, you know, present a challenge in terms of how do you visually identify that in a painting, right? And so those were the kind of things that I was trying to figure out how to solve as I was figuring out how to depict these things. For instance, this would be fracking, which is, you know, you see the fracking tower here with the pipes coursing through what would be Pennsylvania farmland, which one could identify if you're familiar with particularly central Pennsylvania farming, you know, typical kind of like barns that you would find both architecturally and with their decoration. Okay, so just in the interest of time, because I only have 15 minutes left, I'm just going to scoot right through this project real quick. This is a project in England, and it was at a historic house and gardens, and this was from 2012. So it was kind of early on when I was figuring out how to work site specifically. And the family that lived here before part of it burned down was the Messel family, and they had this incredible collection of fans and like handheld fans like you cool yourself with that were often, you know, beautiful objects meant to be part of your fashion statement, that had similar to Brumidi's paintings in the Capitol, where often these fans are reaching back to decorative schemes that are meant to invoke neoclassical ornament that meant that the person carrying it or, you know, identifying with it was worldly, was part of a Western European tradition of, you know, classical Greco-Roman and Egyptian antiquity. And in this case, this fan and another fan I'm going to show you formed the basis of my inspiration for replacing those images. Instead of it being like these classical ruins, which the wealthy elite of Europe would go visit on their grand tour experiences, I wanted to replace it with something that was not so precious and was much more banal. And I decided that I would look in the very backyard of this place is called Nyman's house. I would look in the very backyard of Nyman's house and gardens for inspiration. And this is Gatwick Airport. So what I decided to do by CNC cutting and then hand painting these giant fans was to reproduce images of the airport that essentially was like built over a beautiful dairy farm that was very historic, so that they could make this airport right outside of London. And I thought that was a really interesting like thing that had happened, that the National Trust in England works very hard, you know, to keep precious spaces for the public good, like this wealthy former home of these wealthy folks. And then meanwhile, often will completely overwrite those same potentially very important places for public infrastructure or private infrastructure, or even for things like, you know, warehouses and industrial spaces. So I wanted to kind of like bring that tension to bear within the work itself. And that is how I ended up with scenes of the airport. And in the second fan, with scenes of the roadway that connect the historic house and gardens with the London metro area. So this is like, I think it's about an hour by drive outside of London. So the idea is that a lot of Londoners come to this place for their beautiful Sunday stroll. And I, you know, really kind of wanted to make a kind of statement about with these out of scale kind of theatrical fan props, that this is not picturesque, that there's a kind of emptiness in the Rococo design of this fan or the grand tour designs of the other fan, and their placement as these kind of absurd, oversized hand fans is a kind of contrast to the mission of the National Trust, which is to protect and preserve the historic heritage of England. So this was the small Rococo fan that I then based my design off of. And, you know, I worked with a couple of really fabulous technical assistants to help me render these into drawing files that we then ran through a CNC router. So it's like plastic that's been cut, and then they actually fold. So I could like ship them easily. So after they were cut and then I painted them, they were folded up and shipped, and then sat on site for about 6 months in the location. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about my last couple projects, and I think I have about 10 minutes, so that's gonna be tough because the last project is the one that I most recently finished and I wanna talk about it a lot. So I guess just to set it up, I included this because I wanted to kind of show over the past 3 or 4 years my turn to directly making more artwork about the history of the United States in relationship to the Confederate monuments that are often found in public and private spaces in this country, and the ways in which groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which is an activist group of mostly elite, all white women, or the Sons of Confederate Veterans, have done to erect many of these racist monuments into the public landscape, creating kind of historical and cultural amnesia in this country about the Civil War and about what the Civil War was fought for, and about the history of enslavement in this country, and about the ways in which both law, economic policy, education has been influenced by white supremacist ideas. I don't know if y'all have heard the phrase "the lost cause" before, but the whole concept of the lost cause, at least how the United Daughters of the Confederacy pushed it, was to erect monuments celebrating the heroes of the Civil War. You know, it was also about publishing textbooks that had incorrect information, sometimes absolute falsehoods about the ways in which enslavement functioned in this country. And that's the kind of education that I got when I was a student in public schools in Eastern North Carolina, was hearing either not much at all about the Civil War and about like who the players were and what precipitated it and what Reconstruction was and what Jim Crow is and why these things still exist. The legacies of these things still exist in this country. It was either silence or there was a kind of complicit or tacit acceptance that that the education that was being given would create a kind of falsehood around those things. So the lost cause is the phrase that is often used to describe that process and that that timeline since the Civil War. And groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy would do things like write textbooks or publish textbooks and then lobby to have them included in public education. And so, you know, I went to public schools all the way up through, I graduated from UNC Chapel Hill in 2002, and then I went to a private school for grad school. But y'all probably have heard about UNC Chapel Hill recently in the news because of the tenure information that was coming out about Nicole Hannah Jones, the journalist who was the author and visionary behind the 1619 Project, was denied tenure by the Board of Governors of UNC Chapel Hill. And this is like, you know, you may have heard too about like the public controversies over critical race theory in this country. And so much of that is kind of like knotted up and embedded within like lost cause, cultural amnesia mythologies around where this country's been and where it's going. And so this project I made in 2018 was like trying to kind of look at my school where I teach, and the one of the faculty that taught there, who was a Confederate monument builder as a sculptor, and I made paintings about the monuments that were removed by the mayor and the mayor's commission in 2017, and just kind of examining the history of those monuments. And that was the first time I'd really done like direct research about the United Daughters of the Confederacy and made like direct artwork trying to really grapple with and understand the impact of the Civil War on political and social discourse in this country. And that fed into the next two projects I'm going to share. And because I really want to show the one that's up right now, I'm going to squeeze past this Crazy Quilt project, which is actually kind of a celebratory project. You can see there's like portraits included of important women in North Carolina history, like this white school teacher from the 19th century who was an abolitionist in Western North Carolina, working with the Ackland's collection, mostly looking at the ways in which women are depicted in their collection. You know, women in the history of UNC. So Ackland is on the campus of UNC Chapel Hill. The first Black undergraduate from UNC in 1963, Karen Parker. So making a kind of visual space to kind of reconcile through the use of a crazy quilt all the both historic and contemporary things that would be very familiar to people in the area coming to the Ackland as an on-campus art museum. And because I'm an alum, you know, they invited me as a working artist and alumni, but I also wanted to include things related to the history of the university. Right when I was doing this project, I actually had to like edit this to add that the Confederate monument on campus had been taken down like literally 2 weeks before I was installing my piece, and I wanted to include a commemorative ribbon showing the Confederate monument laying on its back as a kind of acknowledgement of this incredible thing that had been done by activists organizing for many, many years, but especially in a very focused way around the issues of racism on campus at UNC in 2018. And so crazy quilts are like, you know, patchwork quilts that were really popular in the late 1800s. So I kind of was thinking through this period of Reconstruction in American history and teaching myself a lot about that period. And my most recent project that I'm gonna squeeze onto is directly dealing with that era and that period post-Civil War. And, you know, a lot of times what I'm doing with work like this is like using both hand painted as well as digital editing. I'm finding images that may be photographs of like a spoon from one of the founders of the university in the 18th century, incorporating something like my own textiles or something from my own art background. Crazy quilts would often have like animals and you know, mementos included in them. So I was trying to include those kinds of things from the museum's collection as well as from university history. And the whole idea of crazy quilt, you know, during the Trump era, it very much felt like to me like it was important to make space for as much kind of chaos, reflecting the kind of chaos that I was feeling politically, especially in 2018. You know, this would be an example of a commemorative ribbon of an important woman. And this is, like I said, a very positive, trying to sort of lift up North Carolinians, women that I could be proud of. One example here, this is Lma Wiggins, who was a union organizer, musician, and one of the things that's incredible about her legacy and the work she did was trying in Western North Carolina to organize both Black, white, Indigenous workers in the mills for better wages, for better hours. And she's just a real one. Look her up, and has been, you know, largely forgotten within landscape of North Carolina memory. Okay, I'm not going to show this video, but you can go look at it on my website. It's, if you want to learn a little bit more about this project, which I literally have 2 minutes to show you, then you can go watch the video and see more of the physical place. And so this is another project I was commissioned to do on UNC campus. And this is not a celebratory project. It's very much a critical project about this woman whose portrait is hanging over the parlor, over the fireplace in the parlor of this incredible place called the Center for the Study of the American South. And the amazing director, Melinda Lowry, invited a bunch of artists, including alumni like me, as well as current students, faculty, staff, to, after the Confederate monument was torn down by activists 3 years ago, invited folks like me to make proposals for projects that would try to reckon with UNC's racist past and imagine with art a more equitable future. And my project concerns this woman, Cornelia Phillips Spencer, who was kind of like the supreme white lady, white supremacist, patriarchal author of her time, cheerleader for the university, is still held in honor on university campus. And the reason her portrait is hanging inside the parlor is because this was her former home where she lived in the late 1800s before she died. And it was passed down through her family, and they have given that home over to the university, but they have held that her portrait and memory must stay in the building. And there's a dorm named after her, Spencer Dorm, right on Franklin Street, the main drag. And And these are just examples. That's the Confederate monument that came down, and the kind of context in which I was working on this project, including like projects that I did when I was a student in 2001, 2002, where we made a conceptual performance art protest at the base of the statue. And the relationship between the statue and Cornelia Phillips Spencer, the object of my concern in this project, is that she's part of that whole push by white women in the South to uphold white supremacy through their writing, through their activism, through their monument raising. And she was very unusual because she was publishing, this book on the right, for instance, was used frequently in public education in North Carolina and tells absolute lies about what happened in North Carolina and who was important, and, silences about things that were important that are forgotten and left behind in her telling of what North Carolina is and was. And so, doing my research and learning so much about how people have held her in high regard, the paintings that she made that are part of like the historical collection at the college that are reproduced and hung on the wall here. And I know it's time for me to wrap up. So I'll just say, making fire screens, these are historic fire screens. I made like modern copies of them, which would have been conceivable that she had made or would have made in her lifetime as a young, educated, elite white woman, using quotes from her publications. And so I give you examples here of like the kind of text that she was writing about and the ways in which she specifically, there were 5 themes that I was exploring that were examples of how she attacked Reconstruction policies and how she attacked racial equity, talking about like Northern carpetbaggers and local scalawags who were corrupting the ignorant Black freedmen. In this case, this is a one about the KKK and how she thought that they were just fine and definitely supported them. And this one about the attacks on the Civil Rights Bill of 1875 and her insistence on defending white supremacist paternalism. The law was actually eventually declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And this is the kind of failure of Reconstruction that you may have heard historians and others talk about, that she contributed to like making sure that it failed, right? And then the 2 last fire screens that I'll show that are placed in front of the fireplaces inside the Center for the Study of the American South. This is the 4th one. Her role in helping close the college during the radical Reconstruction era's attempts to racially desegregate education, then her avenging to reopen the college for education to only elite white men. And then finally, her fundraising efforts to supply the newly reopened university after the Reconstruction defeat with subscription monies and educational instruments. And she was trying to connect this effort with the sacrifices made by women for men during the Civil War, and that it was the pious duty of Confederate women laying wreaths on the graves of the young heroes to then support UNC as an institution for elite white men only, and that the white women had a role in that. So these kind of quotes that I'm hand painting to look like embroidery, because fire screens are often embroidered, were meant to really highlight and reveal the very, very serious work she had done during her lifetime to publish propaganda to uphold segregation, to uphold white supremacy, and eventually to, in some ways, become like a poster child for the racism of UNC today. And there's a wallpaper piece that I also made that I'm not going to go into right there, but it's behind her portrait and behind her reproduction watercolors in the parlor. And I just know it's time to end. So I'm going to skip right there and stop.
All right. Thank you so much.
Sorry, I went a little over.
No, it's totally fine. We always like to give like a 5-minute leeway. That was amazing. And it's so interesting to see how you mix your art with these, like, I don't know, they feel like these ornamental things that surround your life that could be overlooked. I think it's amazing. So thank you so much. And we're going to take this last 10 minutes to answer some questions. I know that there's already a couple in there already that I'll get to, but if you guys have any more right now, now would be the time to write them into the box, and I'll do my best to get to everyone. So I'm going to start off the questions with Christine. And she says she loves the Firefox series. Those books were part of my world as a child. My grandparents' farmer is in rural Illinois, and she had the series. So I guess that's more of a comment than a question. But
yeah, the Firefox series is really cool. Actually, if you go look in your library, they probably have a bunch of them, and a lot of them are like you know, folk ways of healing and other kinds of like commonly passed along knowledge. And it was actually started by a group of folks in, I think, the Georgian Appalachian region. And it was kind of like an Appalachian project to like retain information and knowledge that would normally be passed down orally, but to try to record it. And it was like adopted in public schools. At least that's why I ended up doing it in Eastern North Carolina. It was like curriculum to go interview your elder to preserve their stories. And that's actually, it's kind of wild. That's in some ways what I do today, in terms of interviewing people and like being super interested in oral histories and things like that. But the Firefox projects are super cool. See if you can find them, probably on the Internet Archive, archive.org.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah, if you, sorry, I'm Chris. If you have not seen these books, you should definitely look these books up. They're remarkable.
Thank you. Our next question is actually, so you might need to share your screen for this if you can, but George Felice, I hope I'm saying all these names right, wants to know if they can see the feedback quilt. You're on mute.
Is it this that George is talking about?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, this, I mentioned the feed sack quilt that that my great grandma made over my shoulder. And so I don't know if George is here or if there's somebody in the chat. I can't see the chat, but yeah, this would be the kind of quilt. I'm guessing that that's what George is asking about. But it's feed sacks for like what feed came in. Oh, and so like farmers would go buy feed or have feed delivered, and the feed companies realized that like the women of the house in the early to mid 20th century had a lot of influence on what kind of things farmers bought. And so they started putting the feed into these colorful, cheaply printed, pretty thin cotton sacks, so like bags that then could be used to make clothing. And that was before they were actually printed with cool patterns. They actually were just plain, but then the feed sack companies capitalized on this reuse and recycling of the feed sacks by the women of the household, and they started printing them in like really bright, cool. And then there's other stuff too, like my mom's clothing when she was a kid. Like this one's from the early 50s, and my mom has been able to point out baby clothes of hers like in here too. So yeah.
Okay, and see. Susan just saying excellent presentation as all. Suzanne saying excellent presentation as always. Thank you so much. Sally, hi Lauren, loved what you've presented tonight. The initial video of your great grandmother really resonated with me and my love of hearing families tell stories. I did this with my uncle as an adult and nearly dropped the camera when he told the certain story that filled in the puzzle.
Talk to your elders, right? And take it with a grain of salt. And then ask really hard questions. Which I was 10, so I didn't know how to do that then. Thank you for that.
Megan Siegel. Fantastic presentation. I'm curious what the reaction of your work has been. How has that influenced where you go next?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question because that, depending on audience and context, that can mean so many things. And I get this question a lot, which is like, has my work ever offended anybody, or like what's the reaction? And it really just depends on who and where. Like I know that my work can offend. I would wonder what a United Daughters of the Confederacy member would think about my work. I mean, I imagine and nor do I care if someone's offended and they're like a racist white person. But, you know, I mean, also in my ways in which I've explored like this violent racist history of this country as a white person, like that is difficult terrain for me to traverse, simply because so much of the way in which I think we understand white supremacy broadly, we understand white supremacy and whiteness in this country is one whereby like the visual culture and notions of like status quo can be very difficult to like unpack or even just get to talking about. And you know I have been imperfect, highly imperfect in the ways that I've like attempted to grapple with those things. And I'm constantly trying to just keep my ears as like big and open as possible, particularly related to when any transgression I have made or will make involves like someone, especially a person of color, feeling harm for the work that I have done. And so like part of what I've been working through is like, how do I make work that engages difficult history without further harming an audience? How do I build trust with audiences that want to have difficult conversations, even if we don't all have the same starting point, either because of our identity or our understanding of history? It's highly imperfect and it's scary, and it feels like a weird thing to be doing in public as an artist, but that's what my work compels me to do. And I'm not sure if whomever asked that question, if that's where you intended for me to go with the answer, but that's just what came to mind.
Thank you so much. Jill said, Lauren, thank you for this wonderful presentation. Have you ever thought about creating a book, or rather a text-focused work, with all of the research you've done?
Do you want to help me? I mean, that would be great. I think that would be really great. There is a lot of research background that, as you can see, the more work I make, the harder it is to make space in the presentation to share. And I should just start cutting things out so I can really dig into, like that work in North Carolina at the Center for the Study of the American South, that's still up, you know, like if and when they are open to the public, you can see it. The research part that I think you're pointing to is really exciting to me, but I love just painting. I just want to make my work, you know? I think it would have been cool to like get a PhD and do research, like some kind of, you know, dissertation-based research project. But I love painting, and if I could do a book project that would allow me to kind of wrap my arms around all that, and especially have like someone to help guide me, because I don't think writing is a strong suit. And I also don't know the specific conventions all the time that historians might overlay on top of research-based things, because there are, you know, discipline-specific conventions that I sometimes totally blow my way through and don't get. Yeah, sure, that sounds great. Give me money, let's do it.
Thank you so much. And this person, it doesn't say their name, it says AAC Art. Oh, someone just commented, hold on. AARC Art Anywhere. I don't know if that rings a bell for you. They said, did the exhibition and UNC result in any takeaway about where UNC should go next, or any future that can be envisioned?
Thank you for that question. There's actually an incredible website that the Center for the Study of the American South made, because the pandemic hit like right when so many of us that were making projects were about to debut everything publicly. And so they made a website, Imagining UNC's Future with Art. And I think it's imagining.unc.edu. I'll try to look it up and throw it in the chat right when we're done talking here. And you should go look at it, because the outcome is like, well, what do you think? What do you think of this incredible work that people who are both current and recently former, and, you know, very former, like myself, students, faculty and staff are thinking about and making about and speaking back to so much of the UNC that is like, sadly, what people know of it, which is the racist board of governors, the controversy, you know, the chief of police that makes almost as much money as the New York City had a police, like the bashing of the students that go to protest, the following of students and activists by KKK members. Like, you know, art is one way in which I think the Center for the Study of the American South decided was a tool for sharing what current and former students, faculty, and staff think about what UNC is. And art's a tool for like imagining other possibilities. So it's like, I would just encourage all of you to go look at what people have made and try to understand and experience like the kind of art that people are sharing as being from and about that place. And I would say, like, sadly, the pandemic affected a lot of things for artists, right? So that's probably been somewhat kind of dampened because the physical things that people intended to share, like me, I don't even think the doors have been publicly open. We've had to do things like build a virtual website and do public talks like this one to share that work, as have the other artists and creatives. So like, sadly, I think that actually has materially affected people's ability to engage with that project. But I've heard really, really good things from people, and I've been able to kind of like share the work broadly in contexts like this, and have heard really good feedback and a lot of positive comments that it's a kind of counterpoint to, like I said, the unfortunately really sad and you know, angering things that we often hear publicly about UNC Chapel Hill.
Thank you.
That helped, yeah.
All right, so I have one more comment and one more question, and then I think we're gonna wrap up this portion because we're running a little bit over, but I wanted to get to these last two. So Judy Kaplan said, a good book for background on the understanding of white supremacy is Caste by Wilkerson. And Eston Walker said, thank you for your wonderful presentation. Have you worked with Wilson Library for the many stories that are gathered there? I know there was a very strong group of women who were fighting for opening the university to women and people of color, contrary to the DAR crowd.
Yeah, the Wilson Library is Eston is where I was able to get access to the archives of Cornelia Phillips Spencer. And, you know, the librarians, I just have to say, like, librarians are amazing. They're doing incredibly important, like, actually visionary work. And it's not just in supporting, you know, projects like mine and helping me, a dum-dum who can't always find what I need in the archives to find the sources I need, but like, you know, actually doing like real public intellectual engagement work, like writing essays, like writing, there's an incredible like librarians guides for Wilson Library around the commemorative landscapes and ways in which like racial terror in North Carolina in particular is evidenced in their collection. So yes, I work with Wilson Library and they're awesome, and support your local librarian, I guess is my message.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Lauren. I'm going to take this time to end our recording. So I just